A guy who transformed his suffering, seclusion, and convulsions into a chilly, hypnotic sound. He was one of the most peculiar sounds to come out of post-war Britain. No one could look away from his voice. You would be mistaken if you believed Ian Curtis was merely the lead singer of the cult band Joy Division, the songwriter of Love Will Tear Us Apart, and died at the age of 23. If that's the case, you're not listening to a tale that surpasses his musical compositions in terms of beauty and tragedy. An artist with epilepsy who still dared to step onto the stage, dancing as if torn apart by the music he created, a depressed adolescent who nearly died from prescription pills at 16, a husband who wed at 19, had a child, and had an affair before he even knew what love was, and finally, an uninspired office clerk. This is the tale of Ian Curtis, a legend in the post-punk scene and the voice of a generation that was afraid to speak up, a tale that has never been told in its entirety until now. Ian Kevin Curtis's birthplace was Stretford, Greater Manchester, and he entered this world on July 15, 1956. A post-industrial neighborhood characterized by smoky streets, brick houses, and an ever-gray sky. Moving to Macclesfield, a tiny, secretive town where everything was supposed to be normal, stable, and silent, was something his family did when he was very little. As a working-class family in post-war Britain, the Curtis were no exception. It was Kevin Curtis, an aerospace engineer, who raised him. Realistic, icy, and down to the slightest detail. Doreen, his mother, was a neat, reticent, and uncommunicative clerk. In such a setting, feelings, particularly those of youngsters, were frequently viewed as nebulous or problematic. Ian was different from other kids even when he was little. Sports were not his thing, jokes were not funny, and he was never one to form friendships. The opposite was true for him. He preferred to read books alone, particularly works of classic literature and poetry. Love Wordsworth, he devoured the poet's poems about solitude, mortality, and self-discovery. His interest in existential philosophy and the futility of existence deepened as he matured. By the time he was 14 or 15 years old, Ian frequently broached the topic of death with an academic air, according to his friends. Absolutely harmless. Next came the first major turning point into adulthood, the age of 16. Ian ended up in the hospital after taking too many of the prescription pain relievers and anxiety medicines. In order to preserve his life, doctors pumped his stomach. Those who knew Ian well believed it wasn't an accident, despite his family's claims to the contrary. They understood it was the first slip, a sign of things to come, a chance to gauge how much interest there was in his existence. He remained unchanged after surviving that moment. Anxieties, introversion, and detachment intensified in Ian. School turned into a mental shackle. Ian was an outsider who couldn't hide his vulnerabilities and had no one he could trust in a conservative culture that still taught men to be silent and powerful. Ian did not continue his education after graduating from high school. However, he decided to work at the Macclesfield Employment Center, where he assisted the jobless and disabled in their search for jobs. There, he encountered lives that were even more shadowy than his own, and for some reason, he felt a strange yet comforting connection. He was uncaring and unjudgmental. As if for an unborn being, he did nothing more than watch, taking careful notes. A young woman who suffered from epilepsy was one of his clients. Except for 1 week, she was a regular customer. It wasn't until after her seizure that Ian learned she had passed away while sleeping. Death lingered with him. In addition to reawakening his dread of losing control, it also laid the groundwork for one of his most evocative compositions. Her composure has slipped. Ian started having same symptoms, including headaches, numbness in his hands, and blackouts, not long after. This was a cruel irony. His life was gradually overtaken by seizures. As though the girl's demise had not only served as an inspiration but also a portent of his own destiny. After dating for a short time, Ian wed his adolescent sweetheart Deborah Woodruff in 1975. Society made a textbook decision. Buy a house, tie the knot, and make your home. We were married at an early age, as Deborah would later confess. We were miserable together, and we weren't old enough to know that we were stuck. They quietly battled despair, disillusionment, and emotional paralysis as they signed the mortgage paperwork, all at an age when they should have been dreaming big. For Ian, music wasn't quite a profession just yet. Like a refuge, it gave him the opportunity to say what he couldn't in real life. That very thing will rescue him and then kill him, he didn't know it yet. Commencing my professional career in the summer of 1976. 3 young males stood out among a tumultuous throng at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall as they watched the Sex Pistols play. In this group was Peter Hook, who would go on to play bass for Joy Division. The future guitarist and keyboardist for the band, Bernard Sumner, was another. Ian Curtis was the third figure. He stood in a darkened corner, his overcoat bearing the word "Hate" emblazoned on the reverse. No, that evening was more than just a concert. The once stale musical terrain of Manchester was rocked to its foundations by this cultural boom. A metropolis where young people without jobs were looking for inspiration outside the polished, produced music of the charts. Following the performance, Hook borrowed £35 from his mother in order to purchase his initial bass. Sumner made a guitar purchase. Along with a drummer by the name of Terry Mason, they established a band. They were just short one thing: a voice. They put a singer-wanted flyer on the door of the Virgin Records store in their neighborhood. After some time had passed, Ian Curtis, someone they knew from the local punk scene, showed up and joined without trying out. His charisma, more than his skill, was the deciding factor in his selection. "We were fine without a good guy," as Sumner would later say. "We needed someone we enjoyed spending time with, and Ian provided just that." Their original name was Warsaw, after the song Warsaw by David Bowie from his album Low. Things started to change soon, though, as they played raw punk with 3 chords, a fast tempo, and anger. Because Ian's words were completely original, even though the music itself stayed simple. Ian composed music about mortality, emptiness, control, terror, and mental specters, in contrast to his fellow punk band songs about politics, sex, or street resistance. To avoid being confused with another band called Warsaw Pact, they changed their name to Joy Division in 1978 after playing a few early performances and making some rudimentary recordings. The new moniker, which is paradoxically upbeat, was derived from a more sinister source, the book House of Dolls, in which the Joy Division was a reference to the brothels where Jewish female prisoners were exploited as bargaining chips by Nazi forces. The moniker sparked debate, particularly since the cover art for their first extended play, EP, An Ideal for Living, depicted a young boy playing the drums while dressed like a member of the Hitler Youth. It was an artistic act of provocation, a chilly declaration of defiance, yet they were falsely accused of Nazi inclinations. Joy Division weren't very technically proficient when they first started out. They were clueless when it came to the professional framework for songwriting. Sumner would experiment with different chords until he found the right one. As Morris pounded on the drums, Hook would lay down a bass line, and Ian would sit silently and compose words, almost like a translator transforming sound into obsession. Even though it was still amateurish, their music started to have a distinct tone, one that was chilly, gloomy, and honest. When he was on stage, Ian Curtis assumed a new persona. Occasionally resembling someone being electrocuted, he hurled himself into space with erratic gestures. Many in the audience first mistook it for a prank, a tribute to Bowie or Iggy Pop. Even more unsettling, though, was the reality. On stage, Curtis frequently had seizures brought on by the beating of drums and the flashing of lights. Art and disease blurred into one another. It wasn't until 1979 that Joy Division started getting notices from alternative media. Journalist John Savage gave them a call after seeing them perform at the Electric Circus. Shortly after, they signed with Factory Records, where Tony Wilson, a forward-thinking producer, would guide Joy Division to even greater heights. They went into the studio later that year to create Unknown Pleasures, their debut album, with producer Martin Hannett. By incorporating delay, ambient noise, expansive soundscapes, and floating synths, Hannett chose a more subdued approach than the intense intensity of punk. Early viewers were dissatisfied with the change, but Hannett built a world where Ian Curtis's isolation seemed like a plea for assistance. As a punk band, Joy Division had evolved. They were the forerunners of postpunk and the springboard for a voice that was both haunting and captivating, unlike anything Britain had ever given the world before. And they were still in the dark. Months had already passed since they began. A turning point in my career. Unknown Pleasures was a total game changer for the British music industry when it dropped in June 1979. suffocating silence, cold mechanical rhythms, solid bass lines, and Ian Curtis' baritone voice resonating like a premonition of estrangement. That was it. No catchy climaxes, no showy guitar solos, and no romantic lyrics. The popularity of Unknown Pleasures was not based on its position in the charts. The press hailed it as the product of a new sonic explosion, the birth of post-punk music that Joy Division spearheaded. The record evolved into a groundbreaking sonic experiment under the direction of producer Martin Hannett. As a means of expression, he utilized digital delay, electronic drumming, and instrument separation in the mix. The end product was an auditory environment reminiscent of a deserted train station, in which the silence of the world reverberated with each tap. At first, the result was not to the liking of the band members. They felt Hannett had made the music excessively clinical and clinically pure, but they were wrong. Mystery solved. From Bauhaus and The Cure to Interpol and Radiohead, Pleasures served as a model for a whole generation of musicians. It was subsequently hailed as the future sound by Mojo magazine. As promised. Even after all this time has passed, the album manages to evoke an eerie, contemporary vibe. There was a burst of activity from Joy Division once the record came out. Midway through 1980, they were invited to perform in the United States for the first time, after touring Europe, appearing on BBC Two, and touring the United Kingdom. Even though they kept a cool, aloof image in the press, they were instantly acknowledged as Manchester's most significant band since the Beatles. They started working on Closer, their second album, at the end of 1979. Closer was more of a diary of hopelessness than Unknown Pleasures, which was a depiction of disconnection. Although Hannett was still the producer, the music took on a more ominous, somber, and ceremonial tone. Atrocity Exhibition, 24 Hours, and Colony were transformed from mere tunes into something more substantial. Just like the album's name implies, these were broken sound patterns, desolate and depressing. Influenced by Ian's personal encounters with a young woman afflicted with epilepsy, She's Lost Control emerged as a standout track from that period. The shaky synths, jerky drum machine, and hurried voices in the studio version give the impression that you are listening to a seizure turned into music. A terrifying and riskiest creative moment for Joy Division. One of the final songs recorded by Ian Curtis before he passed away was Love Will Tear Us Apart, which followed. It was the band's first single to get close to mainstream popularity, and it wasn't even on Closer. Lyrically, it was powerful, but the more approachable melody, gentle synths, and eerie bassline became a posthumous hit. Rather than an emotional tribute or a whimsical fantasy, it is a clinical examination of a relationship on the decline. With a polished and precise sound, the single was finished at Britannia Row, Pink Floyd's studio, after being recorded at Strawberry Studios. Ian was even advised by Tony Wilson, founder of Factory Records, to listen to Frank Sinatra in order to get vocal inspiration. As a result, the performance conveyed the eerie descent into emotional collapse in a calm and collected manner, rather than through cries or pleas. Joy Division had only been around for a little over 4 years when 1980 began. There were no sultry TV characters, no huge marketing campaigns, and no albums that reached number 1. However, they had established a new style of music that merged punk with art, rock with existentialism, and music with mental illness. They embodied a whole generation as a band. They started that period with the passing of their own leader, Private Life. Like hundreds of other young Britons in the years following World War II, Ian Curtis lived his life to a boring rhythm before the stage. Called his name. This person tries to maintain stability by finishing school, getting a secretarial work, getting married young, and having a family. Ian wed Deborah Woodruff in 1975, when he was only 19 years old, after meeting her when they were both teenagers in Macclesfield. Nothing flashy or extravagant happened. Instead, they settled into a modest home, a long-term mortgage, 2 dull jobs, and what seemed like a calm and stable future. However, steadiness rapidly turned into a confining cage. A dreary mistake would be Deborah's later description of their marriage's early years. Neither of them lacked affection, but they were too young to really see the significance of what they were seeking and the things they were gradually losing. The voids in their little dwelling grew wider as Curtis devoted more time to music. Natalie was born to them in 1979. It ought to have been a new start. However, Curtis's sadness was not alleviated by becoming a father. That he wasn't typical enough became even more of a dread for him. As if harboring an inner universe that Deborah was not meant to access, he grew more and more withdrawn and silent. Later that year, Joy Division embarked on a tour of Europe. While in Brussels, Ian crossed paths with Annick Honoré, a journalist specializing in event promotion from Belgium. The rock star Curtis didn't flirt like his contemporaries. Carefully, he took everything in. He broached topics such as poetry, estrangement, and the dread of disappearing. They developed an unclear bond with one another. A combination of camaraderie and sanctuary from a crumbling reality. Their relationship was not physical, Annick insisted at all times. However, the lengthy letters that Curtis sent her revealed an intimate side of his personality that he kept hidden from everyone else. It was as if he were communicating with an alternate ego he had never revealed to anyone, not even his wife or bandmates, in his letters to her. Deborah could feel the shift immediately. She discovered the letters, sensed the increasing separation, and came to the realization that her husband was leading double lives. In Macclesfield, he was Natalie's father and her spouse, but in Annick, he was a lost soul trying to find comfort in the fragile light. No yelling confrontations or dramatic breakdowns occurred. Instead, there was a long period of quiet that grew increasingly frigid with each passing day. The divorce papers were started by Deborah. Curtis remained silent and did not protest or depart. Like someone who isn't sure whether to stay or who has nowhere else to go, he lingered. Soon after, his physical self started to turn against him. His seizures became more regular and deadly by the middle of 1979. The vertigo and migraines progressed to full-blown convulsions, which occasionally occurred while performing. At the Rainbow, Curtis trembled and collapsed mid-performance after a strobe light malfunctioned, staring blankly into the eyes of hundreds. The show had ceased to be a performance. A cautionary tale. However, nobody had a clue. Once upon a time, the band was known for Ian's erratic stage presence, his jerking, shaking, and vacuous stare. This was no longer art, it was a man in a true crisis, completely out of control. Sedatives, carbamazepine, and phenobarbital were among the heavy anticonvulsants recommended to Curtis, creating a potentially lethal combination of medications. Although these drugs reduced seizure activity, they also caused a host of side effects, including irritability, sadness, hallucinations, and insomnia. Friends say that in his last months on this earth, Curtis transformed into someone else. Peter Hook recalled that he no longer was Ian. Sometimes he would just sit there and not say a word, and other times he would cry for no apparent reason. I think he was either over-medicated or misdiagnosed, and nobody realized how bad it was until after it has happened. Deborah saw the shift right away. The husband's estrangement wasn't the only one. It seemed like a mind that had nothing to stabilize it as it plummeted. On sometimes, Curtis would remain motionless, neither eating or talking. On mornings when Deborah would awaken, she would see him sitting still in the dark, hands clasped behind his back, and eyes that seemed to see right through everything. "I adore them both," was what Curtis wrote in his journal at one point. "No one should have to suffer because of me, but I'm wrecking everything." His entreaties and correspondence with Annick intensified. Predictions, sketches of breakdown, loss of control, and a love he couldn't comprehend started to permeate the songs he composed for Joy Division. This wasn't your average marriage in disarray. A mind was fading away from existence. The years leading up to death. Joy Division was about to become Britain's preeminent post-punk band in the start of 1980. They were getting ready for their first tour of the United States after finishing their second album, Closer, which was praised by underground media as a spiritual rite of sound. Ian Curtis, though, did not consider this to be a peak. The drop was steep. At some point, all three of these things, life, reason, and memory, started to fall apart. It was clear that Curtis had changed for the worst. His seizures had escalated to the point where they frequently occurred during performances. Once regarded as artistic hallmarks, characterized by impassioned performances, jerky movements, vacant glances, and shaking limbs, now they inspired genuine terror. During a performance in London, Curtis had a major seizure and collapsed mid-set after an accident involving a strobe light. Everyone in the band froze. Until his unconsciousness, the audience believed it was all part of the performance. No improvement was seen after medical treatment. His neurological system had a negative reaction to the powerful anticonvulsants, tranquilizers, phenobarbital, and carbamazepine that were prescribed to Curtis. His downhill spiral was accelerated by the side effects, which included insomnia, severe anxiety, sadness, and disconnection from reality. Ian was misdiagnosed, according to Peter Hook's later belief. The one individual who appeared to have a genuine grasp of his inner turmoil. Joy division is a tremendous burden, not only for my mental and physical well-being, but also for the fate of other people, Curtis stated in letters to Onik. My patience has run out. It was more than simply weariness. Despair without a voice. Ian overdosed on tablets on April 6, 1980, in his first attempt at suicide. Made it to safety. Following this, Curtis's friends begged him to scrap the US tour, but he was adamant about continuing. I'm good, I can handle this, he proclaimed, even though he obviously lost control. He hardly ate or slept in his last weeks. He would often sit in the dark, compose songs or letters while watching Strosha or listening to Iggy Pop's The Idiot on loop. The story of a German singer who goes missing after being betrayed, banished to America, and eventually takes his own life. Ian invited Deborah to see him on the evening of May 17, a few hours before his departure for the United States. They were in conversation. His last request was that she revoke the divorce papers. She was afraid of what may happen if she abandoned him, so she spent the night despite her refusal. They opted to sleep in different rooms. The following morning, Ian gave her the go light to return at 10 a.m. He had already committed suicide in the kitchen by tying himself to a clothesline when she got back. There was a chilly mug of coffee on the table, and some dweeb was spinning on the turntable. A piece of paper requesting the neighbor to convey a message to Deborah, expressing his desire that they may reunite and begin anew after the US tour, was found instead of a suicide note. Many were perplexed by the message's seeming simplicity. Is it possible that Curtis wanted to end his life for genuine, or was he only attempting to break out of his depression for a short while, not realizing it would be his last? I can't go to America, Peter Hook recalls him saying once. My patience has run out. However, he did mention that he would be taking a break after the tour that very night. I assure you. Even in his own mind, he was being contradictory. Upon further analysis of Curtis's medication records, a neurologist came to the conclusion that the medications he was taking at the time had the potential to cause sudden, unprovoked thoughts of suicide. That is a situation of imminent danger when you are severely sleep-deprived. There was an air of quietness and cleanliness about Curtis's death, as if it had been planned, but it was not overtly planned. There was no farewell in the note, the record was still spinning, and he had just brewed coffee. Not everyone agrees that it was premeditated. Some think it was a panic attack brought on by medicine, extreme loneliness, and weariness. Maybe even Ian was confused. All he knew was that he couldn't take it any longer. At the young age of 23, Ian Curtis passed away. His journey to America was cut short. 2 months down the road, like an unspoken will, Closer was unleashed. Sacred Will. Joy Division's debut and final single, Tear Us Apart, was a commercial success. His tombstone bears a distinctive inscription. Our hearts will be torn apart by love, not by farewell. However, there was something that he himself never completely grasped. Impact and legacies. Ian Curtis's brief 23-year life was cut short. In all, Joy Division lasted for a scant 4 years. However, an unforgettable legacy was created from the remnants of a band that appeared to have been destroyed by tragedy. One that, for more than 40 years, has resounded not only in musical contexts but also in the Western world's collective unconscious. Closer, which came out after Curtis passed away, is now considered a post-punk classic, right up there with albums that defined an era by the Velvet Underground, Nico, or OK Computer. There were no edgy pop illusions or defiant punk cries. Joy Division crafted an unadorned oral environment in which feelings were unfiltered and unrehearsed. Cold, quiet, cruel, and leaving an indelible mark on listeners, each song felt like a mental health diagnosis. Ian Curtis' voice was the beating heart of that sound. As steady as a dreamer speaking in a low, quivering baritone. However, as you continued to listen, it appeared to emanate from a source beyond the physical realm. He kept his cool and didn't shout or implore the crowd to adore him. Like someone clinging to the final vestiges of rationality after a seizure or sleepwalk, he just described what was going on inside, using songs. Even outside of his musical career, Curtis has had an impact. The remaining members of Joy Division founded the band New Order, who expanded the band's sound into synth-pop and contemporary electronic music, carrying on the band's musical heritage. However, Curtis was never succeeded. For them, he became a guide to the hereafter. The enduring spirit that permeated all of their subsequent performances, recordings, and interviews. He had an enormous effect. Some of the bands who have cited Joy Division and Curtis as major influences on their own musical explorations of agony, isolation, and existential dread include The Cure, Nine Inch Nails, Interpol, Radiohead, Editors, and Fontaines DC. Trent Reznor once said, "Without Ian Curtis, there would be no me." Beyond music, Curtis became a postmodern cultural icon, a symbol for generations lost in the fog of industrialization, consumerism, and collapsing identities. In 2007, director Anton Corbin's film Control, based on Deborah Curtis' memoir Touching from a Distance, premiered to global acclaim. The film didn't just portray Curtis, it captured the paralyzing tension between duty and the longing for freedom, a feeling that millions of young people, even those far from music, have deeply known. In Macclesfield, where Curtis grew up and died, fans from around the world still visit like pilgrims. A statue erected in his honor was taken down just days later due to controversy, but that only reinforced a deeper truth. Curtis cannot be boxed in. He was never a celebrity, nor a cool figure to be commodified. He was a wound, and the one who dared open it so others could finally see. Ian Curtis's story isn't a tragedy to pity. It's a reminder of the things we often stay silent about. He never wanted to be a symbol, but became the voice for anyone who has ever